Okay, today we're joined by scholar, poet, novelist, and nonfiction writer, Kevin Oderman, Professor Emeritus from University of West Virginia. And Kevin has written a book on Ezra Pound called Ezra Pound and the Erotic Medium. Welcome, Kevin.
Hi, Val. Good to see you and your class, if I could only see them.
Yes, and we'll be, we're doing this in the summer, but of course the class will start meeting and viewing these. And I think I said we were in week 10 at this point. So they'll be seeing you sometime, I guess, in mid-October or something, in November. So Kevin, tell me, how did you first get interested in Ezra Pound? You wrote, that was your first book.
True, and it was basically a dissertation that I published as a book. One of my mentors saw this manuscript, sent it off to Duke, and they were high on it, so that happened pretty easily. But I got interested in him because he seemed to me to be, I was interested in American poetry, and he seemed to me to be the unavoidable poet, that almost everything flowed through him. And although there's plenty not to like about Ezra Pound, nevertheless, I thought I wanted to understand his poetics, and he attracted me, I think, because of the breadth of his culture. And I think theory was just starting to become a part of what we did in academia. And I was theory averse, and I guess I'm still theory averse. So I wanted to work with poets that you could still try to just understand, puzzle out what was being said. And that could count as scholarship rather than a more theoretical approach to things. So I liked modernists for that reason. And I had some relevant background for Pound. As the level of the MA, I did medieval and Renaissance literature, which turned out to be good background for Pound, who's of course all over the map, and but a lot in the medieval and particularly the Renaissance period. So.
Well, you mentioned, Pound, of course, an American poet and studying in, American literature, and certainly he was born and raised here. And here we're including him in a course in British literature. And I remember that was when I first mentioned this, that was one of the first exchanges. You said, so Pound is British now? So what do you make of that? I mean, is it a misplacement to put him in the British modernist tradition?
You don't want me to criticize you, Phil.
Sure I do.
I don't know. He's certainly, I think, an outlier in American poetry. But at the time of the modernists, there was this big split between those who stayed at home and were really following the injunction of Emerson to create a truly American poetry out of American materials. So you got, William Carlos Williams' epic-like poem is Paterson, based in Paterson, New Jersey, and has a lot of local history, not much European history at all. And then Pound, of course, is gone and lived almost his entire life away from America. And then it's not only that, the HD, I see she's on your list. She also left the country more or less for good. HD, Williams, and Pound were, they were all big buddies. When she was the daughter of a professor at Penn, and Pound was studying literature at Penn, and Williams was in med school there, and they hung out together. And Frost, of course, was a stay-at-home guy writing on American topics, although all these people went to Europe. Stevens another stay-at-home guy. And then on the other side, with HD and Pound, of course, is Eliot. Eliot seems to me to be a tighter fit for your course because he sort of went to England and became English. Pound really just passed through England. And then he was in France, and he settled down in Rapallo, Italy. So he's more, I think, pan-European maybe in his cultural interest than Eliot.
Right. And of course, that collegial collaboration was so much a part of Pound's legacy. You know, I mean, there's people who say, you know, that it's really Ezra Pound who wrote The Wasteland. You know, having edited. What do you make of Pound's contribution to letters overall? I mean, you know, his impact on the way people saw poetry and modernism.
Well, he was a guy with a sledgehammer, and he liked to break things. So he did break up our sense of what English poetry was, and certainly what American poetry was. He had very little truck with really almost any American poetry before the modernist. He has one little side note in favor of Walt Whitman, seemingly, but not much. And I must say, I followed him in that. Even when I was becoming culturally literate back in the late 60s, early 70s, you know, there really wasn't that much American literature for me to like before the modernist. It was, you know, things got interesting with the modernist. And subsequently, I took a bigger interest in the American Renaissance, but that really came later. So.
One of the things that we've looked at, and we you know, tried to go through with some explanation, and there's so much explanation needed, was the first canto, the canto number 1, you know, which of course begins with the rendition, and then went down to the ships, set keel to breaker, and forth in the godly sea. And he begins in the middle of the Odyssey. And of course, as we were talking about the fact that, you know, it's the middle of the Odyssey, but he's using what a Latin translation,
right,
in English, in scup, you know, kind of Anglo-Saxon verse form,
right.
Which
he used that language for the sea, which his translation of the Seafarer before that, and he brings it out for Canto 1. So he's doing a lot of beginnings here. I mean, Homer, at the beginning of what he sees at the beginning of the epic tradition, he thought that passage that he translates was the oldest thing in the Odyssey. I think there's debate about that, but that's how he read it. So he's trying to get back from the beginning, and then he, of course, means to write an epic. He sees the cantos as an epic, so it's his tradition. But yeah, I mean, I think he's also, there's an element of serendipity in the fact that he's translating a Latin text. It's just a book he happened to find in a bookstall in Paris, but he's quite capable of translating it directly from the Greek. I mean, he knows Greek well, he knows Latin well. So, you know, why does he choose this Latin version rather than the Greek version? And I think it has to do with his feeling for cultural transmission and the way, you know, value is passed from culture to culture, from Greek culture to Latin, on into English, his English. So I think that's part of it. And you see the same thing really in your other poem, The River Merchant's Wife, a Letter, where it's a Chinese poem that Fenollosa, whose notes Pound's working from, really gets through the Japanese. Fenollosa doesn't know Chinese, he knows Japanese, and he's working with Japanese scholars. So it's Chinese, Japanese, English, just as this is Greek, Latin, English. But he's bringing things into our language to try to foment a Renaissance. And
what do you make of the ending? You know, I mean, where he goes from this, you know, extremely stentorian, you know, story. I didn't realize that the reason he chose that was because it was one of the more archaic sections of the Odyssey, which makes it even more vibrant and large in scope. And then he goes to a kind of comic ending, you know, lie quiet, Divus. You know, I mean, Andreas Divus.
Including a footnote. I mean, I think that that's not atypical for Pound. He's always working with texts taken from other places all through the cantos. It's strips of text that some of them are directly translated, some are paraphrased. They're all highly selected. I mean, this is a tiny bit of Homer, and even the passage that he includes here was like 15 pages in the original. He's got it down to what, 2?
Right.
So he's being very selective. The ending, I don't know if I'd call that comic or not, but there's also, you know, the Homeric hymns are included there at the end, some very small bits. And these were just happened to be in the Latin volume that he's working from. So again, it's this sort of serendipitous element.
Interesting. So the kind of idea of a collage, or of that, what is it, the iron splinters around a magnet.
Iron filings, right?
Iron filings around a magnet. So the things that are found, and then they form this new shape. If I were going to be so impetuous as to actually go through the cantos and dive into the cantos, how, besides saying proceed with caution, how would I proceed? What would be the best way to climb that mountain?
Well, I mean, Canto 1 is a good place to start. And there's, yes, this is a big fragment, you know, it begins and then. So he's broken off everything before, and it ends with so that colon. So clearly breaking off from what follows. There's that sense of how it's working. But there's also, I mean, the content of this piece. You know, Odysseus, he's standing there pouring blood into the fosse to call up the dead. And that's really what Pound's doing almost throughout the cantos. He's, you know, he's revivifying the dead folks and bringing them to life in the cantos. So it's all a nice suggestion. As far as, I don't think you can casually go to the cantos and get much out of them. So, I mean, I haven't read the whole book for a long time. And it is the education and the Ezra's way of seeing things. And he has very good taste in many, many realms of culture. If you just, I have tracked his, say, the painters he mentions in the cantos, say Memling, fabulous taste. He's a great finder, and in some sense, even though the cantos are so difficult, they're this great distillation of culture, which makes him a kind of popularizer for our time, because nobody can track down, you know, every path he went down to write that book. You can familiarize yourself with some of it. But if you, I think to read him well, you have to read all his prose and all his previous poetry. And he's going to tell you how to read these things, because you can be easily misled by the commentaries on the cantos. And of course, there are plenty of them, because people start reading in the source material to the book as a whole, and often that's inappropriate. I mean, he's doing something very particular, as with Odysseus, talking to Tiresias, the dead Tiresias, and getting Tiresias to prophesy. Now, you should also note that the prophecy in Canto 1 is not good, right? Lose all companions. He's going to get back home, but lose all companions. So,
Right. I've always wondered how Eurycleos.
if when I really knew this material, when I was really up on it, the late cantos, which seem so fragmentary, were just fabulous. Just a word or a phrase would call up his other works, so you knew how to read them, and then those phrases were set against other phrases. The level of condensation is, it's like espresso to weak coffee.
Mm-hmm.
Really good.
And in those Pisan cantos, of course, there's also a terribly tragic personal history woven in. They were written, of course, just after the war, when he was literally imprisoned by the American authorities. How do you you mentioned earlier there's a lot not to like about Ezra Pound.
The fragments are much later than the Pisan cantos, but yeah, he only had a Bible and a book like what you would be creating here of British poetry. That's all he had with him when he wrote the Pisan cantos. The rest of it's just out of his head.
Wow. How do you contend in this political climate today? I mean, we're looking at a man who was on the radio for Benito Mussolini.
Yeah.
That just seems like such an incredible paradox. How do lovers of Pound like yourself, and how do you contend with that? This guy who was so generous and in his personal life, never cared about money, was known to facilitate publications. He helped get Joyce published. He sent Joyce pairs of shoes and all sorts of different people that he helped. Incredibly generous and such a community builder. And then he winds up kind of going off the deep end and becoming anti-Semitic.
Well, of course, there are positive references to Hitler in his writing, and he was a serious right-winger. And you have to ask yourself, and I think this is relevant to the political discussion today, does that invalidate everything? Is all your work colored by the opinions that you might hold? And if you knock out everybody with fascist sympathies from the modernist, you haven't got a lot of people left. That's just true. Yeah. Now, of course, I don't feel as he felt about many things, but I'm not willing to just abandon looking at his work for what it taught me about culture, about structure particularly. And like you say, he had many good qualities to go with the bad qualities. But even after he was locked up in St. Elizabeth's, I do think that he kind of, as you said, went off the rails. I think by the time he was locked up at St. Elizabeth's, he was crazy. But at the same time, even there, he was being generous in the way you're saying. Many poets and scholars went to visit him there, and he was good with them. Nuts.
And of course, Elizabeth Bishop wrote that wonderful poem, A Visit to St. Elizabeth's.
Yeah.
And in deference, and I think anybody who had been indebted to him, either poetically or personally, had to contend with this terrible tragedy of his life, and the fact that he had said all these terrible things in public on the record. It's not just that he was a crypto-fascist. He was.
No, that's right. And you can read the Rome radio broadcasts. I mean, they're not only very right-wing, but they're also just nuts. I mean, they're incoherent. It's incredible.
My.
So,
my. Has Trump been using them for transcripts?
I don't know about that. I think not. Trump would have a difficult time with Pound's English, not to mention the 7 or 8 other languages that he But yeah, I mean, it's a difficult problem, and I thought about that when I was decided to study him. I still thought he was kind of unavoidable. So I don't admire everything about the man, and it's just sort of where we're at.
Do you think that Pound's influence and reputation today, has it remained the same in your opinion for young people, or is he in danger of being forgotten or dismissed? Or do you think that his legacy is even stronger now than ever?
I think his legacy is diminished.
Okay.
And, you know, I used to be very partisan about the modernist. I was on the side of Pound, Williams, HD, and I wasn't very interested in the poetry that didn't spring directly from that. So after I wrote on Pound and Williams and HD, I started writing on the objectivist, and I wasn't interested in the confessional poets. That seemed to me to be a great divide. Subsequently, I gave up my partisanship and realized that there was wonderful things to appreciate all around.
Kevin, as a novelist and writer of travel literature, nonfiction, has Pound had an influence on you and your work in that, or do you see your scholarship and your creative writing in two different modes?
No, I think he definitely had an influence on me on creating my interest in other cultures, deep history. I have some interest that Pound didn't have too, but it made me a traveler. And the novels I wrote are expat novels. And it's not only Pound, I mean, I think also Nikos Kazantzakis, who I was reading even before Pound, had quite a big impact on me, particularly his report to Greco. And he's another great popularizer for broadening our sense of the world. I didn't come to American literature until late, so I'm, I think, a very unusual American literature scholar, was. You know, I first was interested in the Europeans, then classical literature, and I only came to the Americans really in my late 20s, probably. Of course, I'd read Hemingway or a few people like that. But.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin. Kevin's latest book is Cannot Stay, which is essays of travel through Asia, which is a wonderful book, which Etruscan is proud to have published. And we're looking forward to his next collection, which will be forthcoming at some stage. What are you working on, Kevin?
I'm working on another novel. So, and as you know from Wilkes, I'm writing Renga with some friends.
Yes. That's a poem that we heard at the residency, which has a structure. Tell us about that structure, Kevin, of the Renga.
Well, it's a traditional Japanese form. Was incredibly culturally significant in what would be, I guess, for us, the Romantic period. Starts off with what has become a haiku, and then is followed up by a 2-line poem, and then back to a 3-line poem. And each one of these poems connects to the one before and the one after, but not to the whole. And usually each poem is written by a different person. They cycle through. So I've been writing Renga with just one other person, but oftentimes they were written by 4 or 5 different people.
Somewhat reminiscent of Pound in the sense of taking text and reframing it and including other voices.
Yes, and the emphasis on parataxis, I think. I learned a lot from Japanese poetry before I ever started reading Pound about how images and ideas play against one another and what comes out of that white space.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Kevin Oderman, we're delighted to have you here, and I'm looking forward to us crossing paths when paths once again are allowed to cross at whatever time that happens.
Take care of yourself.
All right, you too, and best to Sarah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.